Many years ago, in fact in the mid-60s, I was fortunate enough to find myself in Paris having lunch with the late and very great French fashion designer Yves Saint Laurent. He was in the middle of one of those biannual dramas over whether skirt hems were going up or was it down. I honestly can't remember, but 50 years on it doesn't matter that much. But what I do remember is taking a deep breath and asking Monsieur Saint Laurent whether his clothes, when they reached the stores, would rise or fall by as much as his collection seemed to indicate. Not at all, he said. But he made it clear that unless he was somewhat over-dramatic in illustrating what today we term the general direction of travel, then the journalists and those others that he relied upon to be his messengers simply wouldn't notice, and there would be no imperative for change. Now, I never forgot that lesson. It certainly informed both the manner and indeed the means by which I'll try to get my principal arguments across today. Because politics has taught me that the stultifying, negative, change-resistant power of the status quo has to be overcome. It's largely fueled by fear, and you have to punch very hard to achieve traction for change. And I actually think that's very much what the NMC is about and what it brilliantly succeeds in doing. And that's troubling because I sincerely believe the world's shifting on its axis, and that this is happening significantly faster than most people seem prepared to acknowledge. And this is as true of education as it is of any other walk of life. But we seem to find it particularly difficult in addressing the issue of educational reform for what I believe to be understandable and indeed tragic reasons, and roughly in equal measure. Our understandable reluctance stems from a built-in respect, even an affection, for the learning profession, and our concern that mistakes could all too easily damage the life chances of an entire cohort of young people. But it's also tragic, because by my reading, should we fail to radically change our approach to education, the same cohort we're attempting to protect could find their entire futures scuttled by our timidity. Hence my belief that we've reached one of those great transitional moments in history. The so-called, and for the most part, uncontested American century is visibly drawing to a close. That doesn't mean for one moment that this great nation is in eclipse, or even experiencing irreversible decline, though I do believe that the West as a whole is in what might term comparative decline. So in searching for a useful metaphor to justify my concerns, certainly as they relate to education, I came across what as a former filmmaker I felt to be a sufficiently visceral example to hopefully grab your attention. Now, as Gavin mentioned, I live on the west coast of Ireland, and if there's one thing the Irish love as much as great teachers, it is beautiful horses. Now, the horse obviously occupies a very special place in both the mythology and the practical functioning of pre-20th century industrial world. Dogs may be a man's best friend, but horses have to be our most loved and valued sidekick. And yet both they and their role in our lives have also evolved. Here's a short quote from an exhibition that's currently running at the British Museum in London, entitled simply "The Horse." Horses were first domesticated 5,000 years ago, and since then they played a crucial role in the development of civilization. Horses were essential to ambitious rulers, those who could combine the best technology with the swiftest and most powerful horse, and the greatest skill in handling and controlling them, always held the advantage in battle. So let's agree that mankind owes a very great deal to the horse. They're also smart. As W.C. Fields reminded us, horse sense is the thing a horse has which keeps it from betting on people. Now, to advance my argument a little further, if I may, I'd like to show you a 3-minute clip from a recent movie, Warhorse. Some of you may have already seen it.
Good luck, my friends.
On to walk! Walk! March! On, chapter!
think the movie makes its own point. To all intents and purposes, the technological development of the machine gun almost overnight made the value of the horse in battle a thing of the past. This didn't for one moment mean that we ceased to value horses. In fact, I could argue that we demonstrated our affection for them rather better by ceasing to have them senselessly slaughtered on the battlefield. So the well-positioned and skillfully operated machine gun represented a transformation in warfare, and nothing was ever quite the same again. Technology had in effect trumped raw courage. Unsurprisingly, not everyone agreed. There were those, most particularly in the British Army, who simply refused to come to terms with the realities of automatic firepower. And despite overwhelming evidence suggested that a single machine gun was at least as effective as 80 to 100 men with rifles. An early enthusiast for automated weaponry, Sir Edward Spears, recalled that upon suggesting to his brigade commander that he just notionally mown down an entire brigade with his guns during manoeuvres, received the following dressing down. Here's a young cavalry officer who's been impertinent enough to suggest that the infantry weapons he so inappropriately is carting about have wiped out the 1st Cavalry Brigade, the finest mounted force in Europe. Get off your horse, sir, and walk back to the barracks. That's clearly the only suitable form of locomotion for you. Tragically, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, Sir Edward's assessment of the effectiveness of the machine gun became heartbreakingly apparent. Now, I'm dwelling on all this because it takes us very neatly to the vital issues of priorities and resource. The deployment of the machine gun, to the mounting frustration of its American inventor, Hiram Maxim, was delayed by a combination of fear of change and endless debates over cost and utility. However, once their effectiveness had been established in combat, no nation, wishing to remain remotely sustainable, could any longer argue over the necessity of this investment. The money simply had to be found, and of course it was. The First World War, in many respects, I would argue a self-inflicted and unnecessary war, in addition to costing millions of lives, also cost the combatant nations a grand total of $200 billion at the then prevailing value of the dollar. An unimaginable sum, making a total nonsense of the earlier affordability arguments. So today I'd argue with education. We simply cannot afford not to embrace the opportunities afforded by developments in digital technology. We simply can't afford to countenance the social and the geopolitical repercussions of anything other than brilliantly equipped classrooms and an equally brilliant generation to teach in them. To settle for anything less is without doubt to risk shortchanging an entire generation. Having stolen their pensions, having depleted their environment, and having undermined their confidence in ever getting a worthwhile job, we can't possibly allow them to drift into becoming second-class global citizens through our inability to invest in their future. Should we fail to exercise sufficient imagination and self-sacrifice to offer the same opportunities that we had and to a very great extent squandered, that, to my mind, would be bordering on criminality. Now, almost exactly 15 years ago, I made a huge personal decision to leave the world of cinema after 30 happy and I hope productive years, to engage full-time in the very different world of public policy, most particularly as it relates to education. Unsurprisingly, this involved a pretty steep learning curve, probably a steeper learning curve than most, because my own academic career had in every sense been somewhat less than stellar. Some years ago, when I was being installed as Chancellor of the Open University, I was quite reasonably asked by a journalist which Institute of Higher Education I'd attended. Imagine her confusion when I replied that my university had been the Piccadilly line. In that, boarding the subway at the crack of dawn, I could normally get a seat all the way to my place of work in Knightsbridge, and similarly each evening, when returning home from night school, which I attended, I was once again able to study for an hour or so in comparative comfort. Now, since that time, and during a career that spanned 55 years, I've earned my living in a number of quite distinct areas of interest. In fact, as my wife Patsy never fails to point out, when you take a top-down look at the pattern of my life, it begins to look a little like the London Underground map. At first sight, it does appear to be all over the place, but there's a connecting link that's helped enormously in making each transition possible. And that link could be variously described as knowledge, understanding, or experience, but all of us here would clearly recognize it as education. And what's certain is that everything, and I really do mean everything I've learned through my work in cinema, for UNICEF, and in various other spheres of government, has only reinforced my view that H.G. Wells was right when he suggested that the future really is a race between education and catastrophe. And personally, not finding the idea of catastrophe particularly attractive, I decided some while ago to throw in my lot with education. I spent 6 especially happy years working at the Department of Education with a special remit for teachers, teacher recruitment, teacher retention, and teacher morale. To an extent, I rather went native, and I came to revere teachers and to better understand the almost insane expectations that society places on them, and never more so than now. This is a generation of educators who are being called upon to perform something very close to a miracle, because never before in human history have we sought to develop the intelligence, the competence, and the agile survival skills that will allow a generation to emerge fully equipped into a world of competition and complexity, the like of which we can at present only very, very dimly imagine. Now, if we're to address this challenge, we ourselves have to become significantly more imaginative and more persuasive in our entire approach to what we think of as education. Over the years, I've developed my own theories as to what the classroom of the future might look like. And somewhat paradoxically, my own belief in the value of technology is firmly rooted in the past, as Ruben said earlier, in what worked. As I understand it, the earliest single-room schools were, early on, equipped with something that we'd all recognise as a blackboard, but not much more than a blackboard. The killer app was the development and the popularity of the individual slate. Interestingly, this is a Welsh slate, early Victorian Welsh slate that I've got. I want you to see something. Also, as Keith pointed out, this happens to be broken. Someone has very, very carefully repaired it. These were extremely expensive, but they had the great benefit of being able to take home, taken home and practiced upon. And thus they became invaluable. And in case you think it really is a thing of the past, yesterday in anthropology with my wife, I came across this product. It's called My First Laptop. And the woman at the shop said they are selling in their thousands. So something interesting is happening, and the notion that this type of pedagogy is over is clearly incorrect. This combination of instructional blackboard with the ability of the individual student to copy out from that blackboard and, vitally, to take the slate home and practice, I would argue formed the foundations of a successful pedagogy which didn't much change for a couple of centuries. Now, obviously, we've come a long way since then, with significant improvements during just these past dozen years. But now, what we have to do now is pull together all these key components and allow them to work seamlessly, and most important of all, allow them to work interoperably. My belief is that the future lies with skilled and confident teachers working with the most recent generation of whiteboards, able to stream new content constantly auto-aligned with the curriculum to an interactive tablet in the hands of every child, with embedded software that offers the teacher, again, a seamless process of instant assessment. It's this triad, to me, of the teacher, the tablet, and the assessment process that could, I believe, be the magic, not the magic formula, but an important formula. Of course, in the emerging educational models in which it features, the tablet is in effect owned by the pupil, just as the slate was. And much of their best work could be done from home, with responsibility devolved to the student to source the information on which their studies are based. But even that doesn't crack the final hurdle. And that's the 19th, not even the 20th century problem of assessment. To me, this is far and away the most depressing image I could show you. It illustrates the hopeless lack of imagination that we may be able to bring to bear to the process of teaching and learning, and the way in which we stimulate and channel the talents of all of our young people. In fact, Albert Einstein unsurprisingly put it best when he observed everybody is a genius. But if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live out its entire life believing itself to be stupid. Now that, in effect, describes our current assessment processes. God smiles on those who have a good memory and a committed teacher. Without either one or the other, you're very likely to be condemned to a life that only scratches the surface of your true potential. Just like the First World War, the price of that waste is incalculable, whether measured in human or in GDP terms. Earlier this month, I came across a piece in the New York Times about the financial woes of the California State University system. One of its trustees, Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom, was reported as saying this. He said, "This is code red. We're no longer cutting into muscle or tissue, we're cutting into artery." I think it's a compelling phrase, and it's one I'd suggest we could all adopt when discussing the state of education in the Western democracies. Whilst politicians bicker about what aspects of the budget to cut and by how much, as nations, we in the West are already slicing into our own arteries. Those very arteries that could and should be supplying the flow of bright, engaged, alert young people with the ability to take on and hopefully overcome the woeful political, social, economic and environmental legacy that we've handed them. What's required is not only a well thought through and continuing policy of investment, but also a vision that's sufficiently coherent to ensure that policies right across government are robust enough to keep pace with digital developments in other technologically advanced nations. Keith earlier mentioned Tom Friedman, who I revere. Recently, in one of his articles, he said this with, I think, enormous clarity. Big breakthroughs happen when what is suddenly possible meets what is desperately necessary. Nations that don't invest in the future tend not to do well when they get there. I don't think I'm being wholly unfair in suggesting that there's been something of an institutionalized reluctance, or is it resistance, among politicians as well as teachers and educationalists to fully embrace and optimize the potential of digital innovation. And as a consequence, an increasing disparity has been allowed to open up between life in the lecture hall or the classroom and the daily experience of technology beyond the school and college gates. And I realize, standing here, I am speaking entirely to the converted, but I am talking here about the vast majority, as Keith indicated, the vast majority of our schools. To my mind, the roots of the profound change which those working in education are being required to address run very, very deep. Allow me, if I may, to illustrate that belief with a metaphor. It's a metaphor I've now almost tortured to death, but it remains so true and so vivid that I make no apology for hammering it home at every opportunity I get. If you took a brilliant surgeon from 1912 and dropped him, and it would almost certainly be a him, into an operating theatre today, he could literally do little more than wipe the brow of the patient, take their pulse, and make a cup of coffee. He would be standing with extreme interest watching what everyone else was doing. And why? Because almost all of his skills would have become totally obviated in the intervening 100 years. This has nothing to do with his ambition, his intelligence, or his commitment. He would, quite literally, have found himself transported into a wholly alien technological environment. In fact, he might just as well be on a spaceship. Now, take a similarly gifted school teacher from that same year, 1912. Put her in a class with a blackboard and a piece of chalk and 30 or so reasonably attentive faces, and in most subjects, she could deliver what would be entirely recognizable to every one of us as a lesson. The children in her class would absolutely pay attention to her, and she would be delivering a lesson. And why? Because technology has not as yet been allowed to make anything like the significant impact on the process of teaching and learning as has proved possible in many, I'd go so far as to say most other fields of human activity. I was riveted, Keith, by your note about the 50 out of 50th our appalling position that education finds itself in. Yet I found it incredibly difficult to persuade policymakers that if we're to win back the trust of our students, and therefore have a better sense of the challenges they face, then we need to engage much more effectively with their world and to learn to view technology in the way in which they relate to it through their eyes. to see it as they do, as being utterly transformative, not simply as some kind of useful add-on, but as something that's already changed the nature of the way in which they go about their daily lives, and indeed the way in which they learn and respond to learning. In this respect, it's vital for all those dealing with young people to remember that no matter how gifted or charismatic you may be, you will never successfully influence or teach anyone who doesn't believe you to be entirely authentic. Authentic in the sense that you hold to and that you exemplify the values that you teach. In that way, and only in that way, can they possibly come to trust and respect you. This is a clip from a 1967 movie entitled To Serve With Love. It's a very important film at the time. This was Sidney Poitier playing a young black American engineer who was teaching at an inner London school. And the film had enormous impact. The idea of frankly, of a black teacher in an inner London school in the UK in 1967 was original and unusual. And it did a lot to help people's attitudes and that sense of possibility to improve. Sidney played a charismatic and inspirational teacher, and it's still referred to today as an important film. But if this is a difficult transition for teachers to make, it would appear to be a mountain that's far too high to climb for the present political class. Those whose policy horizons barely seem to extend to next month, let alone beyond this coming November. So it's left to people like us to interrogate and to harness all these opportunities in addressing the very many longer-term challenges that we as a global and digital society now face. And that's important. It's very important, because Europe and the US have been used to being relatively dominant. And my reading of history suggests that once dominant nations feel they are slipping behind, they tend not to behave all that well. And this makes this moment in history a very important one. By way of example, in terms of the challenges we face, most children currently in elementary education will leave school and spend a lot of their working lives in environments dominated by voice recognition technology, with all the productivity benefits along with the changes in working practice that will inevitably bring. But when was the last time you heard anybody even raise that as an issue in education, let alone a problem? And believe me, I've done it a number of times, and there's no quicker way of clearing a room of teachers. It's with enormous challenges such as this that I'd like to draw to a close by restating what I see as the crucial lessons we ought to be absorbing in our efforts to create a more successful society in what is certainly an ever more difficult world. When I use the term successful, I'm not simply or even primarily alluding to economic success. No, as Winston Churchill predicted almost 70 years ago, the empires of the future are the empires of the mind. And I'd suggest that we ignore that at our peril. So, firstly, like it or not, getting education right is far more than simply one among a number of important policy priorities. It is, insofar as the future of this or any other country is concerned, far closer to being the whole ball of wax. Secondly, and this can never be repeated often enough, no education system can be better than the quality of the teachers it employs and, here's the tough bit, the ever-improving standards it's prepared to demand of them and reward them for. Thirdly, teacher training at every level of the education system has to be viewed as an entirely non-negotiable and continuing process, most especially in this incredibly fast-moving digital age. The very idea that a teacher, any teacher, can leave a training institution in their early 20s and still be a fully effective classroom presence 10 or even 5 years later without refreshing their skills is frankly risible. And we do nobody any favours by pretending that it can continue to be acceptable. The commitment of politicians and educational leaders to the best possible quality of teacher training, along with regular, preferably annual, paid time out for professional development, must be absolute. And that commitment, that compact between government and the world of education, must in every respect become a two-way affair. Fourthly, as I discovered during my 7 years as UK President of UNICEF, there needs to be an undisputed global acceptance of the importance of the education of women. Educated women are the fulcrum around which can be built educated and healthy families, and those families are invariably smaller and better cared for. Now, there's no magic or spurious ideology in any of this. As I've said, getting our education system right is the whole ball of wax, and here's why. World-class education systems, and only world-class education systems, can over time deliver world-class health, as well as securing world-class pensions, along with a world-class infrastructure. The reverse can never, ever, ever be possible. The idea you can pump billions into health systems and somehow turn your nation around is a cruel fantasy. In this respect, it's also worth mentioning that current research increasingly links improved education to improved health and life expectancy. So by any measure you care to use, educational expenditure is a win-win, both for the individual and for our global society in general. It does involve massive choices, but to me, there is only one answer. I think we all acknowledge that as a human species, we know more than we've ever known about ourselves and our natural environment. So if I may, I'll leave you with a very short quote from the environmentalist and futurist Stuart Brand, which, whilst ostensibly flattering, is also, I would argue, very cautionary. We are as gods, so we'd better start getting good at it. Thank you very much for listening to me.